Hi guys, welcome to another art video. How are you all doing? In today's video I'm going to be seeing if, using Daniel Smith's watercolour ground, I can use my watercolours to paint on canvas. So if you've never heard of or tried this medium, if you want to know what it is and does it work, I'll be giving you my thoughts on it as we go through the video. And I'll be testing it out on a seascape painting today. The reference photo for this one came from my sister while she was on the beach near where we live. I thought it would be a fun subject idea for this project. So let's get started. I have two different sized canvases I picked up pretty cheaply, as I thought I'd do a quick test piece on the smaller one before putting what I've learned into practice on the bigger canvas. So what is watercolour ground? Well, watercolour ground is a thick liquid medium that, when applied to a variety of surfaces, renders them suitable to be painted on using watercolour paints. It looks rather like gesso, which you'd use to prime your canvas for acrylic or oil painting, but leaves a coating similar to that of cold pressed watercolour paper. Daniel Smith's product says that you only need to apply one layer to most surfaces using either a soft paintbrush, foam pad or roller, and that you must leave it to dry for at least 24 hours before painting on it. I decided to use an inexpensive flat brush and place my canvases on some white printer paper to protect my table. I wasn't really sure how thick to apply this stuff and found that it did leave brush marks as I was painting, so I just tried to make it as even as I could before leaving it overnight to dry. I bought the titanium white, but it is available in other colours and finishes too. Before I started my small test canvas out, I applied washi tape around the outside to try and get a nice clean edge to my painting, as I would do on regular watercolour paper. But one of the advantages to painting on canvas is that you don't need to frame your work in mounts or behind glass, but this was just something I wanted to try. For my first outline sketch, I used a blue Prismacolor colour erase pencil, as I thought it would be less visible than graphite once I began painting, and I wasn't sure how the ground would stand up to me applying pressure to erase or correct any mistakes, in spite of the fact that Daniel Smith does say it's archival once left to dry. I also applied some masking fluid to my canvas to preserve some of the white areas for the foam on the sea and so on. Daniel Smith's website does say that masking fluid can be used effectively with this medium, so I thought I'd test this out as well. The masking fluid I'm using today is the Frisk Masking Fineliner, which is really good for getting the fine details I wanted on this small canvas. So with that all done, it was finally time to paint, and to start with I began with some ultramarine blue for the sky. Now, before I began this little experiment, I did read up a bit on watercolour ground, and it suggested that you need to use less water than you would if you were painting on paper, so I was conscious that I didn't want to make things too wet. The watercolour seemed to lay down fairly easily though, and behaved much like watercolour would on paper. I would say though that the texture of the canvas was a lot rougher than any cold pressed paper I've used, which made painting straight lines like the horizon line, for example, quite tricky, and the paint did have a tendency to feather out at the edges as well, which I noticed when I tried to paint in between the groins, and which I wasn't entirely happy about. I also tried to add in some more colour to the sea in the background whilst the canvas was still wet, which worked to an extent, but I couldn't help thinking it looked a bit streaky. When it came to painting the wooden boards of the groin, again the paint went down nicely, but I did begin to regret using the Prismacolor pencil to do my sketch with, as it did show through and didn't really have any benefit over using regular graphite. So the first light layers of watercolour went down fine, but how about layering? After all, being able to add transparent layers is one of the things unique to watercolour. Well, I found that it was easy enough to apply another layer, and the watercolour ground seemed to hold up at this point, so I continued work on the sea in the foreground before going in with a dark sepia mix on the wooden posts. I hoped the canvas would have dried enough by now that the paint would cover up some of the uneven edges from doing the sea, without bleeding or spreading out. And this did seem to work, but what I did notice at this point was that the watercolour was drying a lot lighter. You can expect this with watercolour, but it did seem more apparent on this surface than regular watercolour paper, so more layers were needed to build up the contrast I was after. And I should have waited longer for the underneath layers to dry more here, as I ended up lifting paint rather than layering it, as you can see on this darker shadow area of the sea. So then it was time to remove the masking fluid, which I have to say worked brilliantly on this surface. It came off easily and left really crisp clear lines, and even though the surface of the ground was quite coarse, none of the paint had seeped underneath it. Unfortunately though, the same couldn't be said for my washi tape. So test piece done, I moved on to the bigger canvas to try and put what I'd learnt into practice. To start with, I used graphite for my outline sketch and used some Scotch magic tape instead of washi tape for my border, and just to be on the safe side, I did an outline of masking fluid around it too. When applying the watercolour paint, I really tried hard not to add too much water this time and consciously allowed extra drying time for the sky before going back in to paint the sea underneath it. So far as using different watercolour techniques on this watercolour ground, I did like the fact that I could use the wet in wet method to mix different colours on the canvas, and I think it worked really well on the sea in the foreground, where I added browns, blues, greens and turquoises together to get the colour and effect I was after. I did also manage to layer the watercolours to get the strength and depth of colour I was after, but it did take quite a bit of work, and with each layer I added, I felt like I was losing some of the luminous quality of the watercolour, making it look more matte. Maybe that's my inexperience with this medium, but I couldn't help thinking that I may as well have used gouache or acrylic. To minimise this more matte finish though, I really tried hard on this second canvas to go in with stronger colours from the start, rather than beginning with lighter layers as I would normally do on watercolour paper. You can kind of see here where I've painted the wooden posts, but the paint still dried so much lighter, meaning further layers were unavoidable if I wanted to get the depth and contrast I needed. But let's not forget here that I'm painting with watercolour paint on canvas. It's not the same as painting on watercolour paper, but like it or not, it does work, and enables you to use watercolour not just on canvas, but on fabric and smooth surfaces like plastic or glass as well. So this opens up a whole load more possibilities, especially since this is also available as a transparent medium. If you wanted to use this medium on some of the smoother surfaces I mentioned, you do have to rough them up with sandpaper first though to give something for the ground to adhere to. So at the end of the day, it's not going to be exactly the same as watercolour paper, and on reading the small print there is a bit of a disclaimer on some websites that warns the results will differ from the effects achieved when using paper, and it's not considered a substitute for watercolour paper. Now, as you may know, I like experimenting with new products, methods and techniques, and whilst I didn't feel like this was the best idea I've ever had, it was still worth a try. It was the first time using this medium too, so I'm sure with practice I might get used to and appreciate its unique qualities and differences. But whilst I was doing this painting, I couldn't help but compare it to regular watercolour paper, and for me I felt like there was too much of a compromise in the unique and beautiful vibrancy and luminosity you can get on watercolour paper, just to be able to use it on canvas. But again, that's just my opinion based on one experience. Despite my reservations though, this product does have amazing reviews, and a lot of them I've noticed are from people who've used it on glass or other surfaces, so maybe that's where it comes into its own. A number of reviews also come from watercolourists who've used it to correct mistakes in watercolour paintings with excellent results, so I'd love to know if this is a medium you've tried before, and if so, what surface have you tried it on, and have you ever used it to correct mistakes when painting on watercolour paper? I'd love to know if anyone has any useful hints or tips on getting the most out of this medium on canvas that I could apply for next time. So drop any comments or information in the comments box, as I always love hearing from you and I'm really grateful for any helpful suggestions. So ultimately, based on today's painting experience, I felt a bit out of my comfort zone, and I'm not sure I would be too desperate to try this medium again on canvas. It does work, but maybe it takes a bit of getting used to fully appreciate. I'm glad I tried out the smaller canvas first, as I was able to learn a few things before I started on the bigger one, and it was nice to try a different subject for my painting this week too. On the plus side, the ground itself seemed to withstand many layers of paint, and the rougher surface really helped to add texture to the wooden slats and posts of the groins. So I think this painting, although it did take a while, did start to come together okay towards the end. And as it did so, I started to relax a bit and really enjoyed particularly building up the sea in the foreground. So with a few more layers added, it was finally time to remove the masking fluid and add some finishing touches. Part of the appeal of this photograph for me was the 4 seagulls all perched in a line, so I really enjoyed this bit. I used a really small round brush to paint them in using leftover colours from my palette for the shadows and adding in a touch of black on each of their tail feathers. Now, in case you were wondering whether masking fluid around the outside of my painting as well as tape worked, well, no, it didn't, as the masking fluid decided to tunnel under the tape, creating channels for the watercolour to seep into. But the watercolour ground can be used to fix mistakes, right? So I applied some of it around the uneven edges to neaten them up, and that worked a treat. I don't think I'll be using tape on canvas again though. So all that was left to do now was to do a few details on the sea. I was really impressed with how well the masking fluid worked and how easy it was to create such a realistic effect for the foam on the water. I again used leftover paint on my palette to add shadows under the waves and on the shoreline. I did also add a bit of white gouache straight from the tube to add back in some of the brighter areas on the wooden slats, which also helped to add texture and contrast. So despite my struggles with this medium and the fact that it took a bit of getting used to, I was pretty happy with how the finished painting turned out. Painting watercolour on canvas is not the same as painting on watercolour paper, but if the more textured matte finish is something you like and you don't want to have to put your watercolour paintings behind glass, then this is definitely something you should try. But that's pretty much it for this video, guys. I really hope you found it interesting or helpful in some way and liked how the painting turned out. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and don't forget to put any helpful comments or suggestions for future videos in the box below. Here's some more videos you might not have seen or fancy watching, so take care, have a good week, and I'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching, bye!